The worst aviation accident in almost 10 years has just occurred. This is American Airlines Flight 5342, also known as the 2025 Potomac River mid-air collision. On the evening of January 29, 2025, American Airlines Flight 5342, a Bombardier CRJ700 regional jet operated by PSA Airlines as American Eagle, was on its final approach into Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. After a flight that originated from Wichita, Kansas, the plane had made stops in Indiana and North Carolina before continuing on to D.C. At the same time, a U.S. Army Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter was operating under Priority Air Transport 25 out of Fort Beaver in Virginia. The helicopter was conducting a routine training mission that involved flying with night vision equipment. As the Black Hawk flew to its training area, it would later pass close to the approach path of Flight 5342 at 8:22 p.m. Flight 5342 was cleared to descend down to 3,000 feet by air traffic control at Reagan National Airport. Just 4 minutes later, the controller asked the pilots of Flight 5342 to further descend down to 2,000 feet. Now descending through 2,000 feet, the controller noticed that the helicopter was too close to the plane and told the pilot of the helicopter to turn right to maintain a safe distance. However, this did not work as the helicopter continued to stay dangerously close to Flight 5342. At 8:31, the controller, now realizing the severity of the situation, told the plane to go around and then immediately went on the radio to try and contact the helicopter. At 8:47 p.m., as Flight 5342 was making its way back towards the airport, the Black Hawk collided with the plane's left wing. The collision happened just half a mile from the runway and 300 feet off the ground. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing sparks coming from the left side of the plane before it disappeared from view. A mayday was transmitted from the cockpit of Flight 5342 as the plane began to lose altitude. It was heard saying, "We have no control," as it descended towards the water below. Both aircraft were on fire as they crashed into the Potomac River. A massive emergency response effort was immediately launched as first responders raced to the scene. Unfortunately, the 67 people on board the plane and the 3 crew members on the helicopter were pronounced dead at the scene. This is the deadliest aviation accident since the 2010 Polish presidential plane crash and the deadliest in the United States. Since the 1996 crash of TWA Flight 800, out of the 70 people who lost their lives in this accident, 64 were passengers on the plane and 3 were service members on the helicopter. Of the 64 people killed on the plane, 58 were civilians and 6 were military personnel who were on their way home after being stationed overseas. In the days following the incident, the NTSB released some details about their investigation into the crash. They stated that the helicopter crew reported visual contact with the airliner and intended to maintain separation. However, it is unclear if they were looking at the correct plane, as radar data shows that the 2 planes were relatively close to one another. The NTSB also criticized the FAA for not acting on data that showed there had been numerous near-miss incidents in the area over the past decade. The chairman of the NTSB said that this should have been a wake-up call for the FAA to do more, and that this accident could have been prevented. This is truly a terrible tragedy, and my deepest sympathies are with the families and friends of those who lost their lives in this accident. Now I want to get into the structure of the video that I think would work best for this topic. The first part of the video, I would dedicate it to talking about the general topic of aviation safety. In this part of the video, I would talk about how aviation is one of the safest modes of transportation and the measures that are taken to ensure that accidents like this are rare. I would also explain that even though aviation is very safe, accidents do happen from time to time, and it's important to learn from them so that we can prevent similar accidents from happening in the future. The next part of the video, I would give some background information about the 2 aircraft involved in the accident. I would talk about the history of the Bombardier CRJ700 and the Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk. I would also discuss the flight paths of the 2 aircraft and their missions prior to the accident. For example, I would talk about the fact that the plane was on its final approach to the airport and the helicopter was on a training mission. After that, I would go into the actual collision itself, and I would talk about what happened in the moments leading up to the accident. I would use the timeline of events to reconstruct the accident and try to piece together what happened. For example, I would talk about the fact that the controller noticed that the helicopter was too close to the plane and told the pilot of the helicopter to turn right to maintain a safe distance. But the helicopter continued to stay dangerously close to the plane. I would also mention that the controller tried to contact the helicopter after realizing that the two aircraft were getting too close to each other. Next, I would go into the aftermath of the accident and what happened in the immediate aftermath of the collision. I would talk about the emergency response effort and the impact that the accident had on the families and friends of those who were killed. Then I would go into the investigation findings and what the NTSB had to say about the cause of the accident. I would go through the preliminary report and the final report and summarize the findings for the audience. For example, I would talk about the fact that the NTSB believes that the helicopter was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that this could have been prevented if the helicopter had been on a different flight path. I would also mention the criticism that the NTSB has for the FAA and what they believe the FAA could have done differently to prevent this accident. Finally, I would conclude the video by summarizing the main points and giving my thoughts on the accident. I would talk about the importance of aviation safety and the steps that are being taken to prevent accidents like this from happening in the future. I hope this video is helpful, and I hope it gives people a better understanding of this terrible accident. If you have any thoughts or opinions on the accident, please share them in the comments below. And if you would like to learn more about the accident, I will leave some resources in the description. Thank you for watching and have a safe flight.